to see there you are, or there I am, as the case may be. I've been talking about mothering all month, and that's a challenge for someone who's a man, but, well, I'll get to some of that later in my series on fathering. But for now, you may remember that I really don't like preaching on Mother's Day. Not that I won't do it, I did it years. Because you can't win. If you follow the common culture with its cards, its carnations, its meals out, and its kind of sentimentality, you look vapid and not very authentic as a preacher. But if you ignore it or criticize it, you look heartless and cruel. Now, that is partly because I'm a male. I cannot say whether this is a problem for my female colleagues or my non-binary colleagues, but I've experienced it as being a challenge. So I divided up the complexity of mothering into several topics. Now, I take some comfort, even now, in knowing that the creator of Mother's Day, Anna Jarvis, also felt bad about Mother's Day. Yes, she herself came to regret founding it. You have to understand that the short history is that when her mother died in 1905, she wanted to sponsor a Mother's Day around the country, even around the world. And she promoted it. And, well, according to Eric Lee in his book, The Buying and Selling of American Holidays, Jarvis enlisted department store magnate John Wanamaker of Philadelphia to help. And in 1908, there was a large observance in the auditorium in his enormous department store in Philadelphia. It was so large that the New York press saw it. They promoted it, and Mother's Day was off and running within a decade. It was widely observed in some time, and now is officially, not just traditionally, the second Sunday in May. However, when you dance with the devil, you dance to his tune. And in this case, John Wanamaker not only wanted to honor mothers, he wanted to advance his business. So he sold a lot of greeting cards and gifts and promoted buying flowers and giving them to your mother and all that stuff. So rapidly did this happen that Jarvis went from promoting the holiday to protesting against it. She organized boycotts. She threatened lawsuits because she had thought she had trademarked Mother's Day. She protested at a candy makers convention so obnoxiously that she was arrested. By 1948, the year she died, she said that she wished, quote, she never would have started the day because it became so out of control. Amen to that, sister. She herself might have taken comfort in that joke about the three wise men, told about how they're riding on their camels heading to Bethlehem, and one says to the other, mark my words, Melchior, this is going to get way out of hand. What did Jarvis really want, though? What was it she was after that got lost in the commerce? Well, that's complicated. In some ways, it was sentimental. A day for honoring the person who gave you birth. Yeah. At the peak of Victorian values, it was to be a day for going to church and sending heartfelt letters when mother was far away. But in other ways, she was part of the changing role of women in America that was changing that very status quo she was honoring. She went to college, Anna did, which was unusual in those days, and she worked for a living, did not actually have children of her own. Her mother, Anne Jarvis, the one she so admired and wished to honor, was among those who served as a nurse in the Civil War, living in West Virginia, where the fighting went back and forth often. To us, more than a century removed, it may seem odd to associate Victorian sentimentality with women's rights, but back then it made perfect sense. And in one respect, the story of Mother's Day is downright radical. But that story begins a few years before 1905. It actually begins in 1861. Just outside Washington, D.C., in Virginia, some Union troops were exercising and being reviewed, and onlookers came to watch them. Among them was Julia Ward Howe. And when she heard one of the companies of soldiers, she heard a song that went, "John Brown's body lay a moldering in the grave." Well, you've heard that. She was already a published poet by then. And her companion who came with her that day said to her, I'm paraphrasing now, "Couldn't you write more suitable words for our men to march as they go off to war?" By the next morning, she had penned the first verses of the Battle Hymn of the Republic. "Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the..." Same tune, different words. That made her famous. And she worked that fame. You should know that. She edited a magazine called the Women's Journal for 20 years, and she used that magazine to promote women's suffrage and temperance, by the way. Thanks to her privileged birth and her well-known husband, she was on personal terms with most of the luminaries of the day. She met presidents, starting with Abraham Lincoln. She was a friend to Mark Twain, Ralph Waldo Emerson. Oscar Wilde made a point of visiting her on his trip years later. She was the first woman inducted into the American Academy of Arts and Letters, and importantly to this sermon, was active in the Sanitary Commission during the Civil War. Well, what is the Sanitary Commission? Well, it was a group devoted to improving military hospitals. More men died of illness and of infection due to their operations than were killed outright by weapons. So the U.S. Sanitary Commission, which was a private organization, raised money to provide equipment, bandages, and all the supplies needed for making clean hospitals, the very sort of thing that her mother used when she was serving as a volunteer nurse. Now, I don't know that they ever met, Anne Jarvis and Julia Ward Howe, but they shared the experience of war and its devastation, and both became, after the war, activists for peace. When the Franco-Prussian War erupted in 1870, Julia Ward Howe resolved to work for world peace by rousing the mothers of the world, writing a proclamation that includes, or shall we say, concludes with these words: "In the name of womanhood and of humanity, I earnestly ask that a general Congress of women without limit of nationality may be appointed and held at some place deemed most convenient, and at the earliest period consistent with its objects, to promote the alliance of the different nationalities, the amicable settlement of international questions, and the great and general interests of peace." Remember what Rebecca said earlier, that when women are involved in peacemaking, it tends to work? Well, there was Julia Ward Howe already sensing that this was something that should happen. Her plan was actually to have an annual Mother's Day for peace. Not just Mother's Day for peace. And it happened, but only for about 10 years and only in and around Boston where she lived. What we have today is entirely different, but it's not unconnected, as Anna Jarvis was inspired by her mother's example of working in a military hospital and in pursuing peace herself. Tomorrow is Memorial Day, itself the result of the Civil War, when various claimants went out to decorate the graves of the fallen, and it was called Decoration Day even in my boyhood. Being a boy in Washington, D.C., I attended the observance at Arlington Cemetery once, and I remember to this day the heat, the humidity, the old men marching in wearing their American Legion caps. Few sights are more stirring than the sentinel at the tomb of the unknowns. And yet, I cannot help but think we would be better off as a nation if instead of having two observances in May, one for mothers and one to commemorate our honored dead, we should restore the dream of Julia Ward Howe and have a single Mother's Day for peace. Lest you think this would diminish the solemnity of Memorial Day, here is part of her proclamation that I didn't read earlier. Let them meet first as women to bewail and commemorate the dead. Imagine that. Let them then solemnly take counsel with each other as to the means whereby the great human family can live in peace. What if Memorial Day wasn't just about remembering the dead solemnly, which they richly deserve, but about working to prevent more dead that must be remembered? We should lament and resolve. That's what Julia Ward Howe was saying, lament and resolve. That seems to me very wise. Lament without resolution is just emotion. Yes, we need to feel the loss, the horror, the sorrow, and the pity. We really, really must allow ourselves that. But if that is all we do, we are guaranteed to need to do it again after the next great tragedy, great war. And over time, lamentation just becomes part of the ritual of dying, burying, lamenting, and having another war. As long as we remember to lament, we can actually go on killing, can't we? If that's all we do. Can anyone seriously say that we honor those who died by having more wars? Apparently so, because in another sense, we have agreed to continue killing each other, or rather to accept killing each other for the grand cause of the Second Amendment. Our regular lament these days is thoughts and prayers, and you've all seen how people are tired of that now. Lament without resolve, at its worst, is, shall we say, emotional theater, emotion without motion, discharge of feelings without the charge of responsibility. We seem to live in a country where personal freedom is so absolute that we will literally sacrifice our children to protect our guns. In my practice of learning Hebrew, I'm reading through the prophet Jeremiah. In chapter 19, which came up this week, he condemns the powers that be with these words. They have built shrines to Baal, an idol, and put their children to the fire as burnt offerings, which I never commanded, never decreed, and which never came to mind. To what extent have we capitulated to the idol of arms? So much so that we are willing to sacrifice our children willingly, again and again, to preserve this valued right. I think we have not come very far over the years, at least spiritually. We may even have backed up. Let me not conclude on a grim note, however. You should know that Julia Ward Howe's companion, the day that she heard the soldiers, was a fellow named James Freeman Clark. And he is a Unitarian minister. For Julia Ward Howe had adopted her Unitarian faith as an adult. But for that chance remark by that one minister, the song may never have been written. Who knows what else might have been different. Meanwhile, still in Washington, D.C., the woman who took charge of those hospitals that the Sanitary Commission was supplying was a woman named Clara Barton, school teacher and devout Universalist. Now, did Julia Ward Howe know Clara Barton? I cannot say any more than I know that Julia Ward Howe ever met Ann Jarvis or vice versa. But in some ways, Clara Barton was affected by Julia Ward Howe as well. In later years, Howe was called the dearest old lady in America. Barton later became known as the American Florence Nightingale. And for those who don't know, Florence Nightingale was an Episcopalian or an Anglican, but she confessed that she was truly a Universalist at heart, like Clara Barton. So in the smallest things that were done on individual days, a remark to a woman who was a poet, the desire to serve for someone who believed that all would be saved, the world does change. That resolution doesn't mean changing a law today, but it means changing your life, and that means changing others. Lament is how we start. Resolve is how we change. We should indeed lament for all who died because of our failure to resolve in the past. But resolve now as well to do for the nation what Irma Garcia did on Tuesday in Uvalde, Texas. When the killer came into the room, she put herself in the way Telemachus put himself in the midst of the gladiatorial fight. For are we not witnessing modern gladiators who grab our attention with their grand guignol of blood and anger? We need to find the courage of a Clara Barton, an Irma Garcia, a Julia Ward Howe, and put up our hands, put ourselves between those and say, stop. It is time to stop. It is time to lament and stop forever. May I find such courage if that moment comes to me. May you find it when it comes to you. And together, we can be the people that Julia and Clara and Florence and Irma did as mothers to our souls at their moment in time. Thank you for your time and attention. I beg your forgiveness for not being more composed.